Mexico Territory, 1889. The late summer sun bled gold across the high desert. A slow, viscous light that caught in the spines of saguaro and clung to the dust kicked up by a tired wind. The air, thin and sharp at this elevation, carried the scent of things that endured horsehide, worn leather, and the clean metallic promise of dry lightning still miles away. A storm that might never break. Here, nestled in the protective crook of a low mesa, sat the Lantern Light Ranch. It was less a sprawling enterprise and more a stubborn foothold against the vast, unforgiving landscape that stretched toward the town of Copper Vale, whose rooftops shimmered in the distant heat. The knock that came was not on the main house door, but on the wide, weathered wood of the stable. It was a soft, hesitant sound, almost lost in the creak of the wind vane and the low nicker of a horse within. Maeve Hollis stood on the packed earth, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went deeper than the trail dust coating her calico dress. At 28, her face held the quiet composure of a woman who had learned to expect little and be grateful for less. Her hands, covered in thin, mended gloves, were clasped before her, a gesture that was part prayer, part self-containment. She had been many things in her travels along the stagecoach lines: a letter writer for the illiterate, a stitcher of wounds when no doctor was near, and always a teacher. It was the teacher who had brought her here, following whispers of a rancher with a collection of children and no woman to see to their letters. The stable door didn't open. Instead, a man emerged from the blinding glare around its corner, leading a horse as black and solid as a chunk of cooled lava. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, his wide shoulders blocking the sun for a moment. He was a man baked by the elements, his skin the color of tanned leather, his eyes narrowed against the constant light. This was Rowan Cutter. He brought the black stallion, Cole, to a halt and looped the reins over a hitching post, his movements fluid and silent. He didn't seem surprised to see her, but his gaze was as direct and unyielding as the land itself. It was a look that assessed, weighed, and filed away information without offering any in return. It was polite in its stillness, yet utterly guarded. "Mr. Cutter." Maeve's voice was lower than she intended, roughened by dust. He gave a single, spare nod. His attention was on loosening the horse's cinch, his large, calloused hands working the leather with an ingrained familiarity. "My name is Maeve Hollis. I was passing through Copper Vale. They said you have children here." She felt the need to get to the point, sensing that this man had no patience for pleasantries. "I am a teacher. I would like to offer my services, to teach them to read, to do their sums." Rowan Cutter finished with the cinch and finally turned his full attention to her. His eyes, a pale, startling blue in his sun-darkened face, held no discernible emotion. They simply watched. Silence stretched, filled only by the wind and the soft stamp of the horse's hooves. He was waiting. For what? She didn't know. Perhaps for her to lose her nerve and retreat back down the long, dusty track she'd walked. A knot of old, familiar pain tightened in her chest. It was a truth she had learned to carry like a stone in her pocket, one she offered up when necessity demanded it, a strange and bitter currency. She took a shallow breath, her gaze dropping to her own gloved hands. I cannot bear children, Mr. Cutter," she said, the words barely a whisper, offered not as a plea for pity but as a statement of fact. It was her qualification, the explanation for why a woman like her was adrift, why she was here, bartering for a place. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer a word of misplaced comfort. His expression didn't change at all, but the quality of his silence shifted. He considered her statement as he might consider the sky for rain or the condition of a fence line. Then he spoke, his voice a low baritone, as dry as the air around them. "Good," he said, the word coming out as easily as an exhalation. "This place needs people who stay. It doesn't need more children." The bluntness of it should have stung, but it didn't. It was simply the truth as he saw it, delivered without malice. It was, in its own stark way, an acceptance. Before Maeve could process it, a flicker of movement at the corner of the ranch house caught her eye. 3 small heads had appeared in the kitchen doorway, clustered together like quail chicks. A boy, the oldest at perhaps 10, stood slightly in front, his face a mask of solemn curiosity. A smaller girl with 2 tight braids clutched his shirt, her eyes wide, and peeking from behind her skirts was the smallest, a little boy whose thumb was firmly planted in his mouth. Jasper, Millie, and Bo. They were not related by blood. That much was clear from the varying shades of their hair and the different shapes of their faces. They were a constellation of strays, watching her, the new, unknown star that had just appeared in their sky. Maeve remembered the talk in the Copper Vale General Store, the hushed words exchanged over barrels of flour and bolts of cloth. They said Cutter collected children the way other men collected debts or grievances. They said he'd taken Jasper from an orphan train that had stalled out with fever, Millie from a failed mining camp where she'd been left behind, and little Bo from, well, no one was quite sure about Bo. The stories painted him as a strange, solitary man building a silent family from the scraps of other people's tragedies. The consensus was that the Lantern Light Ranch was a quiet place, but not a cold one. Looking at Rowan Cutter's unreadable face and then at the 3 watchful children, Maeve understood. This wasn't a home in the conventional sense. It was a harbor. She straightened her shoulders, her purpose renewed. I don't ask for wages, Mr. Cutter. Just an opportunity. Let me hold a lesson on your porch this afternoon. If you find my teaching satisfactory, all I ask in return is a plate of what you're having for supper and a place to sleep. A cot by the hearth would be more than enough. Rowan's gaze shifted from Maeve to the 3 heads in the doorway. They ducked back inside the moment his eyes fell on them, but he knew they were still there, listening. He turned his back to her and leaned a shoulder against a thick porch post, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked out over the parched land, over the endless expanse of earth and sky that was his domain and his prison. He was weighing her proposition against the disruption she would bring. She was another mouth to feed, another body within the fragile peace of his quiet world. But she was also an answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. A long moment passed. Finally, he gave another one of his spare, decisive nods, more to himself than to her. It was an agreement that sounded like a command he was issuing to his own reluctance. All right, he said, without turning around. The tension Maeve hadn't realized she was holding drained out of her, leaving her feeling lightheaded. She walked toward the porch, her worn boots scuffing in the dirt. As she passed the hitching post, she laid a hand on the open primer she carried in her satchel, its pages filled with the simple alphabet that was the key to a larger world. Her fingernails, visible through a tear in her glove, were chipped and lined with the grime of a long journey. A few feet away, Rowan's hand rested on the leather reins of his horse. It was a powerful hand, the knuckles scarred, the palm and fingers layered with the thick calluses of a man who fought the drought with his bare hands and wrestled a living from an unforgiving earth. 2 hands, 2 worlds, now set to intersect on this small, dusty porch from the direction of Copper Vale. A faint, metallic ringing carried on the wind the bell from the small adobe church, calling the faithful to evening prayer. But woven into that sound was another, harsher one, the rhythmic clank and scrape of a railroad handcar on steel tracks. The Azul Western Railroad Company, their survey lines were cutting closer every week, a relentless steel serpent inching its way across the territory. The sound was a low thrum of dissonance, a premonition of an outside world that would not leave this quiet valley in peace for long. Maeve stepped onto the porch. Rowan pushed off the post and walked past her into the house without another word. The screen door swung shut behind him, the latch clicking into place with a definitive, metallic snap. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet. The air itself seemed to change, to settle. Something had been sealed. This house, this quiet harbor built for those who had been lost, now had a second person who knew how to stay. The first morning at the Lantern Light Ranch began not with a bell, but with a smell of wood smoke and chicory. Maeve had slept on the narrow cot by the hearth, a space that was all corners and draught. yet it was the deepest sleep she'd had in months. When she emerged into the kitchen, the three children were already seated at the rough-hewn pine table. They looked like a trio of captured birds, small shoulders hunched, hands hidden in their laps. Jasper, the eldest, watched his plate with fierce concentration. Millie, braids already tight for the day, stared at a knot in the table wood. Bo, the smallest, kicked his legs rhythmically against the chair, a soft, thumping sound in the quiet. The breakfast was simple biscuits from a Dutch oven, slightly blackened on the bottom, and butter that Rowan had clearly churned himself, pale and crumbly. There was molasses in a jar. Rowan sat at the head of the table, eating with an efficient, quiet focus. He'd nodded to Maeve when she entered, a movement that was more a dip of his chin than a greeting. Maeve took the remaining seat. The silence was thick, broken only by the scrape of knives on tin plates. The children didn't look at her. They ate in small, quick bites, as if afraid the food might be taken away. When Maeve reached for a biscuit, Millie flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, and then froze, her eyes wide with the terror of having drawn attention to herself. "It's all right, Millie," Maeve said softly. "I'm just getting a biscuit." The girl didn't respond, but her shoulders tightened. Maeve took her food, her heart aching. These were children who had learned that new things, new people, rarely meant safety. They were quail, precisely as she'd thought. One loud noise, one sudden move, and they would scatter to the shadows. Later that morning, she began. Rowan had left for the range before dawn, his departure as silent as his presence. Maeve gathered the children on the wide, shaded porch. She had no slate, no primers other than the one in her bag. Instead, she took a piece of white chalk, a treasure she'd guarded for miles, and knelt on the sun-warmed wooden planks. "We don't need paper to learn," she said, her voice calm and even. She drew a large, sweeping curve on the wood. "This is a C. It's a strong letter. See how it's curved, like the horn on Mr. Cutter's saddle." Jasper's eyes flickered from the drawing to the stable, where he knew the saddle rested. He made the connection. Maeve smiled and drew another. "And this," she said, making a long, sinuous line, "is an S. It moves like a water snake in the arroyo." Bo giggled, a small, choked sound, and clapped a hand over his mouth. "That's right," Maeve encouraged. "It's a slippery letter. Snake." She worked for an hour. She drew pictures. A for an apple, though they'd likely only seen dried ones. B for boot. M for mesa. She didn't press them to speak. Not yet. She just drew and spoke and filled the porch with the gentle, scratching sound of chalk on wood and the quiet authority of her voice. As she was drawing a D for dog, she noticed Bo's feet. His small, scuffed boots were on the wrong ones. The left was on the right on the left, the toes pointing awkwardly outward. He was walking on the insteps, but he hadn't complained. Maeve stopped the lesson. "Bo, may I look at your boots?" she asked. He stared at her, his thumb creeping toward his mouth. He nodded, a tiny, jerky motion. She knelt in front of him. The dust on her skirt settled around her knees. "It's hard to get them right sometimes, isn't it?" she murmured. She didn't just pull them off. Her hands were slow. She worked the laces, her fingers moving with a deftness that came from years of mending and tending. The laces were stiff with dirt. She untied the knots, slipped the worn boots off his small, sockless feet, and paused to rub the red marks on his ankles. Then, she gently slid the correct boot onto the correct foot. "There, that feels better. I'll wager." She looked up at him. "A boot needs to face the same way you do. Forward. In." She tied the laces, not with a simple granny knot that would tumble undone, but with a neat, square knot. A small, efficient bow that would hold a tiny, practical gift. Bo wiggled his toes inside the boots. He looked down at his feet, now pointing straight, and then up at her. He didn't smile, but the wariness in his eyes receded, replaced by a profound, silent consideration. He had been touched with care and without hurry. In his world, that was a miracle. From their spots. Jasper and Millie watched the entire exchange. Millie's hands, which had been restlessly twisting the end of one of her braids, stilled. Jasper, who always stood slightly apart from the others, on the very edge of any activity, watched Maeve's hands. He was the observer, the one who measured the adults in his world by their actions, not their words. He saw the knot. He saw his brother's feet. He filed the information away, his young face giving nothing away, but his posture relaxed by a fraction. He was following his own silent rules of order, and Maeve had just passed a test. That afternoon, Rowan returned, cold, dark with sweat. He walked past the porch as Maeve was showing Millie how to hold the chalk. The 3 children were seated in a row, their backs against the ranch house wall, still as statues, their attention fixed on the letters Maeve had drawn. Rowan stopped. He looked at the chalk marks. He looked at the 3 quiet children. His gaze rested on Maeve, who met it steadily. He said nothing, but as he turned to walk toward the stable, he gave a nod. It was so slight it was barely perceptible. A minute dip of his head. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. A thing was happening, and he would permit it to continue. That night, the house settled into a deep, rural dark. The wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves. A lonely sound. Maeve lay on her cot, listening to the house breathe. She heard the children turning in their shared room, the creak of their bed frames. Then, hours past midnight, she heard a different sound, a soft, shuffling footstep in the main room. She sat up. By the faint, silvery light of the moon coming through the kitchen window, she saw a small white figure. It was Beau, his nightshirt hanging to his knees. He was asleep, his eyes closed, his arms slightly outstretched. He whimpered, a tiny sound. "Gus," he mumbled. "Come on, Gus, good boy." Maeve rose from the cot, her own bare feet silent on the cool floor. She approached him slowly, not wanting to startle him. He was dreaming of a lost dog, a companion from a life before this one. "It's all right, Beau," she whispered, her voice a low hush. "You're safe." She scooped him up. He was light, all small bones and lingering warmth. He didn't wake, but his body yielded to hers, his head burrowing into the hollow of her neck with an instinctual trust that clutched at her heart. She carried him back to the small room he shared with Jasper and Millie. Jasper was awake in his own bed, a sliver of moonlight catching his watchful eyes. He said nothing, just watched Maeve as she gently laid his brother back on the cot. She pulled the thin wool blanket up to Beau's chin, her hand lingering on his soft hair for just a moment. She met Jasper's gaze across the dark, gave him a small nod of reassurance, and left. Back in the kitchen, she couldn't sleep. She stoked the embers in the stove, adding a single, small piece of mesquite by the low light. Her eyes fell on an object hanging from a nail by the window. It was a tiny, knitted shawl, no bigger than for a doll or a newborn. The needles were still in it, a ball of soft, pale yellow yarn attached. It was halfway finished. A project interrupted. She reached out and touched the wool. It was soft, hopeful. It felt like a promise left to breathe in the air, waiting for someone to return and complete it. She wondered who it had belonged to. A few days passed. The porch became a school. The silence at the dinner table became less strained. Millie began to answer in one-word whispers. Jasper started pointing to letters he recognized. One evening, Rowan came in with a rip in the shoulder of his thick canvas work shirt. He sat at the table under the single oil lamp, pulling a needle and a spool of black, coarse thread from a tin box. He set to mending it with a clumsy, powerful determination. He held the fabric bunched in his large fist, pushing the needle through with a force that was all wrong. "You're going to break the needle," Maeve said softly, taking a seat opposite him. He grunted, frustrated. He pushed again, and the needle glanced off the thick fabric and drove straight into the pad of his thumb. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, and pulled his hand back. A perfect, dark bubble of blood welled up. He stared at it, momentarily defeated. Maeve didn't hesitate. She didn't fetch a rag. She simply reached across the table and held out her own hand, palm up. When he looked at her, confused, she tapped her forefinger. "Here," she said. He hesitated. Then slowly, he reached out and wiped the drop of blood from his thumb onto her finger. It was a strangely intimate gesture, stark and practical. She wiped her finger on her skirt. "Let me," she said, holding her hand out for the shirt. He looked from her hand to her face. Then, a small, unused muscle in his cheek twitched. A sound escaped him, half grunt, half chuckle. At the same time, Maeve felt a bubble of laughter rise in her own chest. They both smiled, a small, shared laugh that was so quiet it barely disturbed the air. It was a sound of two solitary people recognizing the shared absurdity of their situation. It was as fragile as a soap bubble, and they quickly smothered it, as if afraid the sudden noise might shatter the tentative peace they were building. He handed her the shirt. "The thread is too thick," she explained, and she began to sew with small, even stitches. The next morning, when Maeve woke, the cast-iron kettle was already on the stove. Not hot, but warm. Someone had risen in the pre-dawn cold to fill it and set it over the banked embers, so she would have warm water to wash her face. There was no note, no word was spoken of it. It was simply there, an act of kindness laid out in the open, as tangible as the warmth itself. That night, after the children were asleep and Rowan was checking the livestock, Maeve permitted herself a private moment. She pulled her small carpet bag from under her cot and took out a simple linen box, no bigger than her hand. It was tied with a faded blue ribbon, and embroidered on that ribbon in neat, careful stitches was a single name, Eliza. She opened the box. It was empty, save for the scent of lavender and memory. This was her ritual of grief, the box that held the space for the daughter she had held for only 3 days. She would open it, and the tears would come, a quiet, cleansing flood. She sat on her cot, her hands cradling the box. She waited. She thought of the child's face, a blurred, perfect memory. She thought of the overwhelming loss that had set her adrift, that had defined her for so long. But tonight, sitting in the quiet kitchen of the Lantern Light Ranch, with the sound of Bose even breathing in the next room and the memory of Rowan's rare, quiet laugh, the tears did not come. There was a familiar ache, a deep and permanent sorrow, but it no longer drowned her. For the first time, she could hold the box, remember Eliza, and still feel the solid floor beneath her feet. This new, fragile life was not replacing what she had lost, but it was, perhaps, giving her a place to stand again. Far from the ranch, on the rise where the desert scrub met the newly laid tracks of the Azul Western, a man stood watching the distant speck of light from the ranch house. He was nondescript, dressed in a brown duster and a worn hat. He lowered a small spyglass, clicked it shut, and took a small notebook from his pocket. He licked the end of his pencil and scribbled a short, precise entry. Cutter. 3 children. 1 woman. New arrival. Holding school. He snapped the notebook shut, his face unreadable in the twilight. He turned and disappeared down the embankment, melting back toward the railroad line, a shadow moving along the steel. The porch was their school. The lessons, once confined to chalk on wood, now lived in the world around them. C was no longer just a curve. It was the C in Cole, the C in Cutter, the C in Copper Vale. The children, once silent as stones, began to offer up words of their own. Millie was the last to find her voice. She would follow Maeve's hand as it wrote, her lips moving silently, but the sound remained trapped. Then one afternoon, Maeve wrote the girl's own name, sounding it out slowly, Millie. "That is you," Maeve said, tapping the wood. "This word belongs to you, Millie." The girl's brow furrowed. She traced the letters with a small, chapped finger. "M-I-L, L," she whispered it, the sound as faint as a moth's wing. "Millie?" She looked up, her eyes wide with the sudden, staggering power of it. "That is me." The next day, Millie approached Maeve with a clenched fist. She was vibrating with the shy, desperate energy of a child about to perform a great feat. "For you," she whispered. and opened her hand. On her palm lay a small, slightly grubby loop of string. Threaded onto it were 3 beads, one a chipped blue, one a cloudy white, and one a bright, fiery red. It was a ring. "Millie, this is beautiful," Maeve said, her voice catching. "It's a thank you ring," Millie mumbled, her face glowing pink. "For my name." Maeve felt a pressure build behind her eyes. She slipped the string onto the ring finger of her left hand. It was clumsy and childish, and to her, it was more brilliant than a diamond. It was the first gift she had received that was given purely from affection in longer than she could remember. She wore it with a profound, shy pride. Rowan watched this. He watched everything. He missed little. From the way Beau's boots were now always on the correct feet, to the way Jasper had stopped standing at the edge of the porch and now sat with the others. He saw the beaded ring on Maeve's hand, and he saw the way she protected it when she washed the dishes. A few days later, he found her staring at the vast, shimmering line of the distant mesa. "You haven't seen the boundaries," he stated. It was not a question. "No, Mr. Cutter. You should. A person should know the edges of where they live." He walked toward the stable. Cole is gentle, for a war horse. It was his form of an invitation. 20 minutes later, he was leading the great black stallion, the animal's power a coiled spring beneath the heavy saddle. He cupped his hands for her boot, but Maeve, used to mounting from stagecoach wheels, found her own way up, settling into the deep seat of his saddle. Her leg hooked modestly around the horn. Rowan checked the cinch, his movements economical. Then he looked at her. "Your balance is off. You're leaning against the cantle. You'll strain your back." And his, "Sit forward." She tried to adjust, but the saddle was built for a man, her small frame lost in it. He sighed, a small huff of impatience, though not at her. He stepped close. "Your foot," he said, tapping the stirrup. "It's too low." He didn't wait for permission. He bent, and his hand large, rough, and browned by the sun closed around her ankle. It was a shock. The touch was not gentle, but it was not rough. It was secure. It was a working man's grip, confident and impersonal. Yet, through the thin cotton of her stocking and the leather of her boot, his hand was intensely warm. The calluses on his palm and fingers telegraphed a history of hard labor, of roping and building and fighting this land. He held her ankle for only a moment, lifting her leg as he adjusted the stirrup buckle with his other hand. It was a light touch, utterly proper, but it sent a jolt clean up her spine. He released her. "Better?" he asked, his voice low. She could only nod, her throat suddenly dry. He didn't take the reins. He simply walked beside the horse, his long strides easily keeping pace. "Cole knows my step," he said, as if sensing her nervousness. "He won't bolt." They moved out past the corrals, toward the low, sandy dunes that marked the eastern edge of his property. The rhythm of the horse's walk, the solid presence of the man beside her, the vast, silent sky it settled over her. She felt, for the first time, not like a visitor, but like a part of the landscape. She leaned forward slightly, resting a hand on the saddle horn, and breathed deep. The air was clean. It held the scent of dry pine from the higher elevations, the sharp, clean smell of the horse's leather tack, and something else, the faint, honest smell of the man himself, of sun-warmed cotton and healthy exertion. It was the scent of a high-country song, grounded and real, and it made her feel inexplicably safe. They were almost back to the ranch, the sun dipping low and painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, when the children ran from the house to meet them. Beau, in his excitement, outpaced his own small legs. He tripped over a loose stone and went down hard in the dust. For a moment, there was a terrible, stunned silence. Then came the sharp, ragged intake of breath that always preceded a child's wail of pain. But it never came. By the time Rowan helped Maeve dismount, she was already moving. She reached Beau as he was pushing himself up, his face contorted. His knee was a mess of dirt and scraped skin. a bright bead of blood welling up. Maeve knelt in the dust, her skirt pooling around her. "Oh, Bo, that's a brave tumble," she said, her voice perfectly calm. Bo's lower lip trembled, his eyes swimming. It hurts," he gasped, but he held the tears back with a fierceness that broke her heart. "I know it does. Let's get it clean." She helped him to the porch trough, Rowan watching from a distance. She soaked a clean rag, her movements all business, the nurse taking over. "This might sting for a moment," she warned. She washed the grit away, her touch gentle but firm. Bo winced, squeezing his eyes shut, but he didn't cry out. When she finished, she leaned in, as her own mother had done for her, and blew softly on the scrape. The cool air soothed the sting. Bo opened his eyes, and a small, watery chuckle escaped him. "What's so funny?" Maeve asked, smiling as she dried the skin around the wound. Bo looked down at his knee, then up at her. "'Cause," he said, his voice small but proud, "Mama always taught me not to cry." The words hit Maeve like a physical blow. Mama, a ghost from a life he barely remembered, a lesson in survival that had become his armor. She looked at this tiny, resilient boy who had learned to swallow his pain, and her throat closed. She didn't correct him. She didn't tell him it was all right to cry. She just brushed the dusty hair back from his forehead. "Well, your mama taught you to be very strong. You are the bravest boy I know." Rowan turned and walked away toward the stable, his shoulders tight. That evening, a new dynamic settled. Rowan, who usually ate inside with the children, took his plate of beans and cornbread to the porch. He didn't sit. He leaned against the same post as that first day, half sitting on the railing, one boot hooked behind the other. He ate like a man who was only pausing, ready to spring into action. The children were inside, Jasper quietly reading to Millie and Bo from the primer, their voices a low murmur. Maeve dried her hands, got her own plate, and pushed the screen door open. The scrape of its hinges was loud in the twilight. She didn't ask. She simply pulled one of the heavy wooden chairs from inside and set it on the porch, opposite him. She sat, her plate in her lap. For a long time, they ate in a silence that was no longer strained, but companionable. "In Illinois," Maeve said, her voice soft. "We had rain, not like the storms here that tear the sky open. We had soft rains, rains that would last for days. The world would turn green, a green so deep it almost hurt your eyes. The mud would smell like new life, and the sound of it on the roof, all night long." Rowan stopped eating. He didn't look at her, but his attention, which was always fractured, always scanning the horizon, focused entirely on her. His stillness was absolute. He was listening. Completely. She told him about the farm she'd grown up on, about the crowds in Chicago, about the wide, flat black earth of the prairie. She spoke of a world that was wet and green and full of people. He listened to every word, his face a mask in the growing dark. But she knew he was seeing the things she described. She was filling his dry, silent world with her memories. And he was letting her. When she finished, the crickets had taken over the sky. She stood, gathering her plate. "Well, I should." As she turned, the hem of her worn skirt caught on a splintered piece of wood on the porch railing. She was held fast. She tugged gently, but it was snagged tight. "Wait," Rowan said. He set his plate down and was in front of her in 2 strides. He knelt at her feet. She froze. "There's a nail," he murmured, his head bent. She looked down at the crown of his dark hair, at the width of his shoulders as he shielded her from the last light. His large, rough fingers worked at the fabric, his touch surprisingly delicate. He was as careful with her dress as he had been with Bo's knee. He worked the cotton free from the splinter and the snag of the nail. It took only a moment. "There," he said. He looked up. She was looking down. Their eyes met. He was kneeling, his hand still resting on the wood near her skirt. She was standing, her hand over the beaded ring on her finger. The air between them became thick and still. In the quiet, with the house of sleeping children at their backs, and the vast, dark territory before them. The silence stretched, saying more than a dozen conversations. He had, with that simple gesture, protected her. He had untangled her. He held her gaze for a heart-stopping second before he stood, retrieved his plate, and stepped past her into the house. Maeve stayed on the porch, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs that was unsteady and new. She watched him through the kitchen window. He moved to the sink, but he didn't turn his back to the room. He stood sideways, his gaze lingering on the dark doorway, and then on the window, where she stood. She realized, in a flash, that she had never seen him turn his back on a door. It was the reflex of a man who had lost everything that wasn't nailed down, the reflex of a man who expected trouble, who had been blindsided before, a man who had lost more than he had ever been given. A few days later, Jasper was struggling with a word. What should we call you?" he asked. Frustrated with schoolmistress. "You can call me Maeve, Jasper." He shook his head. "That's a name." "It is," she smiled. "Miss M," Millie whispered, testing the sound. Jasper pounced on it. "Miss M, that's good. It's fast." From that day on, she was Miss M. The name, like the ring, settled onto her. Another piece of this new identity, woven from the needs and affections of this found family. That night, the heat broke, not with rain, but with a storm of dry lightning. The sky flashed white, followed by low, rumbling thunder that vibrated in the floorboards. The tin roof of the ranch house ticked and pinged as the temperature changed, the metal contracting. It sounded like small, nervous footsteps. Maeve sat at the kitchen table, her small box of writing supplies open. She was writing a letter to a sister in Boston, a letter she knew she would never send. It was for herself. The children are bright. Jasper is watchful, but his heart is good. Millie is finding her voice. And little Bo has adopted a stray lizard he calls Gus. I am teaching them. But I think, perhaps, they are teaching me. She paused, her pen hovering. She wanted to write about the quiet rancher, about the safety she felt when he was near, about the jolt that went through her when he touched her ankle, the way the world stopped when he knelt to free her dress. She wanted to describe the feeling that was growing in her chest, a feeling so large and unfamiliar it terrified her. Her hand trembled. The pen nib scratched against the paper. She could not find the words. She could not, would not, dare to put a name to the hope that was taking root in her, here in this dry, impossible soil. She quickly folded the letter, unfinished, and put it away. Miles away, in the smoke-filled, lamp-lit office of the Azul Western Railroad in Copper Vale, there was no such hesitation. Silas Grigg, the railroad foreman, a man with a thick neck and eyes like chips of slate, stood over a large territorial map. His clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, was using a red pencil to trace a line. The line ran directly through the parcel of land marked Cutter R. "That's the one. Mr. Grigg," the clerk said, tapping the map. The survey team confirmed it. The main aquifer, the one that feeds the whole valley, runs right under his arroyo. He's sitting on the only reliable water for 50 miles. Silas Grigg took a puff from his cigar, the red tip glowing in the dim light. He blew a cloud of smoke at the map, obscuring the lantern light ranch for a moment. "A steam engine can't run on sand," Silas said, his voice a low gravel. "We need that water. The company needs this valley. This cutter is an obstacle." "He seems dug in," the clerk offered. "Got those stray kids. Now this new school teacher." Silas smiled. It was not a pleasant sight. Everyone has a lever. If he's got kids, he's got vulnerabilities. He tapped the red line on the map. "We don't need to buy him out. We just need to dry him out. Cut Cutter's water. A man with 3 children and a woman won't stay on land with no water. He'll leave. The railroad needs this valley. And by God, the railroad will have it." It was a still, hot afternoon. the kind where the world seems to be holding its breath. The heat pressed down on the lantern-light ranch, silencing the birds and baking the very color out of the sky. Rowan was in the shade of the stable, mending a bridle, his movements slow and deliberate. Maeve was on the porch, watching the children. They were playing a game of mountain climbers on the top rail of the main corral, a structure built of thick, sun-bleached pine. Jasper, at 10, was agile, balancing with an easy confidence. But Millie, emboldened by her recent successes in reading and her new status as Miss M's prize pupil, was trying to mimic him. She lacked his natural grace. "Be careful." "Millie," Maeve called out, her voice tight with a sudden, sharp premonition. The warning came too late. Millie shifted her weight. Her foot slipped on the smooth wood, and for a terrifying second, she clawed at the air. She fell. It was not a long drop, perhaps 5 feet, but she landed badly on the hard-baked earth. Her left arm trapped awkwardly beneath her. For a beat, there was no sound at all. It was the terrible, vacuum-like silence that follows a bad fall. Then, a single, sharp, agonizing scream tore through the afternoon. Rowan was moving before the sound even finished. He vaulted the lower fence rail, his face a mask of sudden, cold terror. He reached Millie in 3 long strides. Dropping to his knees beside her, "Millie," he breathed, his voice ragged. "Millie, girl, are you—" He saw the arm. It was bent at an angle that arms should not bend, the small bone of her forearm visibly displaced, jutting against the skin. The sight broke his famous control. The man who faced drought, dust storms, and the threat of the railroad without flinching was completely undone by the sight of this small, broken child. A rare, raw panic flooded his eyes. His large, capable hands that could rope a wild steer or build a house, became useless. They hovered over Millie, shaking, clumsy, afraid to touch. "Don't!" he stammered, as she tried to sit up and screamed again. "Don't move! Jasper, I don't—" He was frozen. "Rowan!" Maeve's voice cut through his panic like a fresh blade. It was not a scream. It was a command. She was at his side, her skirt in the dust, her eyes not on Rowan, but on the injury. In that instant, the teacher, the hesitant traveler, was gone. In her place was the nurse, the woman who had set bones on stagecoach lines and stitched wounds by lamplight. "Rowan," she said again, her voice low and absolute. "She needs a splint. Now, I need 2 flat, straight pieces of wood, about the length of my forearm." She held it up. From a crate, a shingle, anything, quick, and bandages. Find the cleanest sheet in the house and tear it into strips. The direct orders snapped him out of his terror. He was a man who understood action. He nodded, his face pale but his eyes clear again. "Wood," he said. "Jasper," Maeve commanded, not looking away from Millie. "Run to the kitchen. Bring the kettle of warm water, the lye soap, and all the clean rags you can find. Go." Jasper, who had been standing white-faced and trembling, bolted for the house. "Bo," she said, her voice softening. The little boy was standing nearby, his face crumpled, his thumb jammed in his mouth. "Bo, I have the most important job for you. I need you to come here and hold my hand, very tight. Can you do that? Be my brave man." Bo nodded, his eyes huge, and crept forward, his small, sticky hand gripping hers. Rowan was back in seconds. He hadn't bothered with a crate. He'd grabbed a new, smooth-planked cedar shingle and his Bowie knife. With 2 precise, violent motions, he split the shingle lengthwise, creating 2 perfect, rigid splints. His hands, clumsy in their panic, were now swift and precise in their purpose. "Millie," Maeve said, her voice dropping into a low, soothing cadence. She gently began to wash the dirt from the girl's arm, her touch light as a feather. "Millie, darling, listen to me. Your arm it's taken a bad turn. We have to make it straight so it can heal. It is going to hurt for 1 moment, a single, sharp moment, like a bee sting, but faster." Millie was crying, silent, terrified tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "It hurts. Miss M, it's broken. I know, but we will fix it. We will. I'm going to set it right. And then I'm going to tell you a story. Do you remember the story about the river that thought it was a mountain? It was all crooked and lost, just like this. Maeve's voice was a soft, steady hum, a river of sound for the girl to float on. Jasper returned, his arms full, panting. Maeve dipped a rag in the warm water, her hands moving with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. "Rowan," she ordered quietly, "I need you to kneel behind her. Put your hands on her shoulder and her chest. Hold her steady, no matter what." Rowan moved, his large body bracketing Millie's, his hands gentle but immovable. "All right, Millie," Maeve whispered, positioning the two splints on either side of the arm. "It's time. Can you be brave for me?" Millie looked at Maeve, her small face a mess of pain and trust. She squeezed her eyes shut and bit down hard on her own lower lip. Drawing a bead of blood, she gave a single, sharp nod. "I can bear it." Maeve took a deep breath. "Now," she said to herself. She placed one hand on the girl's elbow and the other on her wrist. With a single, firm, practiced motion, she pulled and twisted, setting the bone back into alignment. A terrible, muffled scream tore from Millie's throat, a sound that made Rowan's entire body go rigid. "It's done," Maeve said instantly, her voice full of relief. "It's done. You did it. Millie, you were so brave. The worst is over." Her hands flew, wrapping the torn bandages, securing the splints, her movements neat and economical. She fashioned a sling from another strip of cloth, tucking Millie's arm securely against her chest. The girl was shaking, sobbing in great, gulping breaths, but the sharp, agonizing edge of the pain was already fading into a dull, heavy throb. Rowan's hands were shaking again. He watched Maeve, her face damp with sweat, as she stroked Millie's hair, whispering to her, her voice never breaking. He looked at the neatly splinted arm, at the calm that was settling back over his daughter. He looked at Maeve as if he was seeing a burning bush, a miracle in the dust. She had taken his chaos and his terror and forged it into order. He didn't move for a long time. Then, Maeve looked up at him, her own adrenaline beginning to fade. Rowan cleared his throat. The sound was like rocks grinding together. He had to try twice. "Thank you," he said. The words were raw, torn from him, but they held a weight of gratitude that filled the small space between them. It was the most honest, most vulnerable sound she had ever heard him make. Maeve just nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Rowan's gentleness returned. He slid his arms under Millie, one beneath her knees, the other supporting her back, and lifted her as if she were made of smoke. He carried her into the house and laid her on her cot. That night, the ranch was quieter than Maeve had ever known it. The hearth was lit, not for warmth, but for comfort. The low, red-orange glow pushing back the shadows. Maeve sat in a straight-backed chair beside Millie's cot, listening to the girl's breathing. Millie was finally asleep, her face pale in the firelight, her small hand clutching the beaded ring Maeve had given back to her for comfort. Maeve was exhausted, but she wouldn't sleep. She would watch. She would be the guardian against the fever or the pain that might come in the dark. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting there when a shadow fell across the room. She looked up. Rowan was standing in the doorway that separated the main room from the kitchen. He was just a silhouette, his wide shoulders filling the entire frame, his head nearly touching the lintel. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood, a silent, massive guardian, watching over them both. His shadow, cast long by the lamp in the kitchen, fell across Maeve and the cot, enveloping them both. He was guarding the guardian. Hours passed, near dawn. Millie's breathing was deep and even. Rowan had finally retreated. Maeve allowed herself to move, her muscles aching with stiffness. She went to the kitchen table, poured a cup of water, and her hands shook from fatigue. She thought of Millie, of the panic that would come when the pain returned. She took a piece of paper, a rare, precious scrap, and her pen. She dipped it in the ink. She wrote, not a letter, but instructions. When the pain feels large, make your breath larger. Breathe in. Count 4, feel the air fill you. Hold the breath. Count 2, breathe out. Count 5. Push the pain away. Repeat. You are the boss of your own breath. She left the note on the table where he would see it. When Rowan found it hours later, after Maeve had finally succumbed to sleep on her cot, he picked it up. He ran his calloused thumb over the letters. He had seen her chalk letters on the porch, but this was different. This was ink. Her handwriting was beautiful. It was not the utilitarian scrawl of a clerk or a rancher. It was elegant, the loops and lines perfectly formed, as if each letter had been measured and tailor-made. It was the writing of a different world, a world of education and refinement. And it was here, in his kitchen, teaching his children how to breathe. The next day, Maeve rode to Copper Vale for supplies and to have Dr. Kincaid, who was passing through, look at Millie. The doctor confirmed the splint was as good as any I could have done. Better, maybe. But while Maeve was in the general store, she heard the whispers. The men by the Cracker Barrel weren't talking about Millie's arm. They were talking about the railroad. Silas Grigg had been in town. He'd met with Everard Pike, the county assessor, and he'd left with a signed permit. A permit for what? One man asked. Surveyin', up on the arroyo, right behind Cutter's land, talking about water management for the locomotive line. That's Cutter's water, another muttered. You blocked that arroyo. His well is dry inside a month. A cold knot formed in Maeve's stomach. It was happening, but it was the next whisper that stopped her blood. That ain't the worst of it. Pike was making noise, asking who'd be witness to Cutter's adoption papers. Seems he ain't got none. Pike said the territory don't look kindly on unregistered orphans in an unsafe environment. And a land dispute. Well, that sounds mighty unsafe. Maeve left the store, her purchases forgotten. She stood on the boardwalk, looking toward the distant mesa that hid the ranch. She had come for shelter. She had stayed to teach, but after yesterday, she was something more. She was the one who could stop the bleeding, who could face the panic, who could build order from chaos. And now, she understood. Her presence at the ranch was no longer a matter of her own survival. It was a matter of theirs. Rowan was the stone wall. Jasper, Millie, and Bo were the fragile crops. But she was the living fence. She was the part of the ranch's defense that could think and feel and fight back in ways Rowan didn't know how. A gust of wind hit the main street, lifting dust and paper in a chaotic, angry spiral. A dust devil. It spun past her, fierce and unpredictable. A whirlwind coming from nowhere. A challenge that didn't need a ticket to arrive. Maeve watched it go. Her jaw set. The challenges were coming, and she had to be ready. The fragile piece of the ranch, so carefully knit together by chalk dust and quiet evenings, was torn apart by the arrival of a single buckboard wagon. It was not a farmer's wagon, but a county vehicle, black and officious, and it carried a man who seemed to be made of the same materials. Everard Pike disembarked with a leather satchel, adjusting the tight collar of his city shirt. He looked at the ranch at the porch school, at Millie's arm still in its sling, at the silent, broad-shouldered man who came from the stable to meet him with an air of profound disapproval. Rowan Cutter was dust, and Everard Pike was paper. Mr. Rowan Cutter. Pike did not offer a hand. He had a thin voice, the kind that was used to giving orders and writing fines. Rowan nodded, his hands at his sides, his gaze flat and wary. Maeve had come to the porch, standing just behind him, her hands clasped. Pike opened his satchel and produced a sheaf of papers, affixing one to a clipboard. I am Everard Pike, Territorial Assessor for Copper Vale County. Acting on behalf of the Child Welfare Commission, it has been brought to the county's attention that you are harboring 3 minors, unrelated to you by blood. He didn't wait for a response. Jasper Cole, aged 10. Millie Farrow, aged 7, a boy. Bo, aged approximately 5. Last name unknown. Is this correct? They're my children, Rowan said, his voice a low rumble. They are not, Pike countered, his voice sharp. You hold no articles of adoption, no writ of guardianship. You are, in the eyes of the New Mexico Territory, simply a man living with 3 unrelated children, an unregistered orphanage. He looked around, his nose wrinkling. The conditions are rustic, unsafe. There is no accredited school. I am a teacher, Maeve said, her voice clear and strong. Pike's gaze slid to her, dismissing her instantly. You are an itinerant, Miss Hollis, not a legal guardian. The Territory cannot place the welfare of children in the hands of a drifter. He held out the paper. This is a formal notice of inspection and removal. You have 10 days, Mr. Cutter. 10 days to appear at the county office with legal documentation proving your fitness and formal custody. You must prove this facility is safe. Pike's eyes glinted. If you fail, the children will be remanded to territorial custody and transferred to the Santa Fe Children's Home for proper placement. Rowan did not move. He seemed carved from the same hard mesquite as the fence posts. He slowly reached out and took the paper. His eyes scanned the legal, threatening words. Maeve saw his hand, the one that had been so gentle with Millie, clench. The paper crumpled in his fist, his knuckles white, the veins in his forearm standing out like thick rope. He said nothing. He was a man of action, and this piece of paper had rendered him powerless. His gaze lifted, passing over Pike, and found Maeve. It was a look of profound, silent fury, and beneath it, a desperate, terrifying plea. This is your world. This is paper and words. I cannot fight this. Maeve stepped forward, moving slightly in front of Rowan's shoulder. Her eyes were as cold and direct as Pike's. Mr. Pike, she said, her voice level. You are mistaken. You must not confuse a roof with a home. This is not a facility. It is a family. These children are fed. They are safe, and they are learning. We will be at your office, and we will provide your proof. Pike gave a thin, dismissive smile. The law is the law, Miss Hollis. 10 days. He turned, climbed back into his buckboard, and drove away, leaving a cloud of accusation hanging in the dust. Rowan stood for a full minute, the crushed paper in his hand. Then, with a sound that was more animal than human, a low groan of rage, he turned and stalked into the stable, the sound of him slamming a bucket across the packed earth echoing back to the porch. Later that evening, in the dim, smoky interior of the Copper Vale Saloon, Everard Pike nursed a small whiskey. A large shadow fell over his table. A good day's work, Everard, Silas Griggs said, sliding into the opposite chair. The railroad foreman signaled for a bottle. Pike looked uncomfortable. It felt harsh. Silas, the children. One of them just had her arm set, and the woman, the new one. Rules are rules, Griggs said smoothly, pouring 2 glasses. You're just doing your job. A job that, I might add, the railroad appreciates. Those children are his weakness. And the Territory, bless its bureaucratic heart, has regulations for everything. He seemed stubborn, Pike mumbled, drinking his whiskey too fast. Stubborn men break, they don't bend. Griggs smiled, leaning in. You just keep the pressure on. You follow the regulations. You find this home unsafe. A man can't fight a drought, the county, and the railroad all at once. He'll need money for lawyers. He'll need time for hearings. He won't have time to run his ranch. He'll break. And when he does, Griggs tapped his glass. That aquifer will water our locomotives all the way to California. Just do your job. The rest will take care of itself. At the Lantern Light Ranch, the 10-day clock had started ticking. The children felt the change instantly. The quiet suppers, once becoming comfortable, were now thick with a new, adult tension. Maeve found Rowan by the corral, long after the moon had risen. He was staring out at the land, the crushed paper still in his pocket. Rowan, she said softly, we need a strategy. I cannot fight Pike if I do not have the truth. He said you have no papers. Why? Rowan didn't look at her. His voice was flat. I took Jasper to the home in Santa Fe. When I found him, his folks had passed on the train. They were just going to ship him back east. I took him there. I saw the place." He paused, and Maeve saw him swallow. "It was clean and cold, rows of gray beds. They put a number on his shirt. They took his name. He looked smaller." He picked up a stone, his thumb rubbing it smooth. "So I walked back in, picked him up, and put him in my wagon. I told the man I'd made a mistake. I couldn't leave him there. And Millie, her PA was a drunk miner over at Silver Ditch. Just walked away. Left her in the camp. Bo," his voice cracked. "Just once, a tiny fracture. I found him near the Azul line. His ma she was gone. Fever. He was just sitting there, trying to wake her up. He threw the stone, hard, into the darkness. I didn't set out to be a good father. I'm not. I looked at them, and they were cold. I had blankets. I had a roof. I just chose not to turn my back. I couldn't." The confession hung in the air, a testament to a decency so profound it was almost elemental. Later, the house was too quiet. Maeve, checking on Millie, noticed that Jasper and Bo were not in their beds. A cold fear gripped her. She moved into the main room, her heart pounding. "Jasper," she whispered. A tiny scuffle. From under Jasper's cot. She knelt, peering into the shadows. Two pairs of eyes stared back. Jasper was lying on his back, his arm thrown protectively over Bo, who was curled against his side. "Jasper, what are you doing?" she asked gently. "Shh," Jasper whispered, his voice trembling. "We're waiting for the train to pass." Maeve's breath caught. "What train, honey?" "The train," he insisted, his voice muffled. "You gotta be quiet when it comes. You hide, then it passes, and you're safe. But you can't make no noise." She understood. He had overheard. The man, Pike, had said Santa Fe home. To Jasper, the home was inextricably linked with the orphan train that had brought him west, the rolling machine that had taken his parents and threatened to take him. He was hiding from the train, his only known coping mechanism for profound loss and fear. Maeve didn't tell him to come out. She lay on the floor, her cheek on the cool, dusty wood, so her eyes were level with his. "There is no train, Jasper, not for you, not for Bo," the man said. His voice wobbled. "He said we're not blood. He said this isn't a real home." "Oh, Jasper." Maeve's heart ached. She reached her hand under the cot, palm up. "The man is wrong. Home doesn't ask for blood. Home asks who stays. It asks who shows up every day, who makes the biscuits, and who mends the shirt, and who teaches the letters." His small, calloused hand found hers in the dark and gripped it tight. "Rowan stays. I am staying. This is your home, and no train is going to take you from it. I promise." He held her hand for a long time, and then, slowly, he and Bo crawled out. A new fire was lit in Maeve. She went to the kitchen table, pulled out her small, precious box of paper and her inkwell. The lamp burned late. She began to write. She wrote to Reverend Alden in Copper Vale, reminding him of the Sundays Rowan cutter, who never attended church, had spent repairing the church's roof after the hailstorm. She wrote to Mr. Hemlock, the blacksmith, asking him to testify to the character of a man who sat up all night with him when his prize stallion was sick, just so he wouldn't be alone when the horse had to be put down. She wrote to Mrs. Odessa Wren, the formidable proprietor of the Copper Vale Inn, a woman who had been a field nurse in the war. She reminded Odessa of the night Rowan had ridden 30 miles through a blinding sandstorm to bring her the wounded surveyor, saving the man's life. She wrote to the postman. She wrote to the general store owner. She wrote until her fingers were cramped and the ink was low. She was building a fortress of character, one letter at a time. The next morning, she presented her plan to Rowan. "The letters will help," she said, her voice crisp and certain. "They will prove your character, but Pike is right about one thing. The law needs a name on a line. It needs a legal guardian." Rowan's face was grim. They'll look at me, a rough man, alone. They'll say I'm not fit. You won't be alone, Maeve said, meeting his eyes. We file for joint guardianship. You, Rowan Cutter, as legal protector and provider of the home, and me, Maeve Hollis, as custodian of education, health, and welfare. We will bind them to us with the law, the way Pike wants. Rowan stared at her, stunned into silence. You would put your name next to mine on a paper like that. You, who could leave tomorrow. I told Jasper that home is about who stays. She said simply, I'm staying. They rode into town that same day, not waiting for the deadline. They walked into Everard Pike's small, dusty office. He looked up, surprised and annoyed. We are here to file, Maeve said, placing her stack of letters on his desk. Testimonials of character. Then she placed a second, single sheet down. And our application for joint legal guardianship. Pike read the paper. His discomfort was visible. He was a man who followed rules, and this was not in his rule book. He leaned back, summoning his bureaucratic authority, a small, unpleasant smirk touching his lips. Joint guardianship, that's novel, he said, tapping his pen. A rancher and a traveling teacher. He looked from Rowan's imposing, silent figure to Maeve's unyielding gaze. This is a family welfare matter. Miss Hollis, the territory prefers stability, a traditional family unit. He leaned forward, playing his trump card. And you two, you aren't married. He said it with an air of finality, as if this, at last, was the uncrossable line. Rowan tensed, sensing the trap closing. This was it. They had lost. Maeve did not flinch. Her gaze became so direct it was almost a physical weight. Mr. Pike, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. The law is a tool. You seem to be using it as a weapon, but you have, I believe, misread the manual. Pike's smirk vanished. The territorial statutes, Maeve continued, her words precise, allow for any two responsible, unrelated adults to file for joint custody, provided one can prove financial provision, which Mr. Cutter's ranch does, and the other can prove moral and educational provision, which I, as a certified teacher, do. We are here to state our duty. You are here to record it. She pushed the paper an inch closer to him. Or perhaps, she added, her voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper, you would prefer we wait. We can have this discussion at the formal hearing, in front of a territorial judge, where I will, of course, be submitting these letters. She tapped the stack. And where I will, under oath, ask Mr. Silas Grigg exactly what financial interest the Azul Western Railroad has in the welfare of 3 orphan children. I wonder what the judge will make of that. Everard Pike's face went the color of his bleached white shirt. She had him. He knew it. He looked at the hard woman in front of him. He looked at the silent, terrifying rancher at her side. He looked at the door, as if wishing for escape. Finally, defeated, he picked up his pen. The paperwork, he stammered, will be complex. We have 9 days. Maeve said the clock was ticking. 9 days. Maeve had become a general planning a siege, and her fortress was the Lantern Light Ranch. Her currency was not bullets, but character. She rode into Copper Vale, the children left in Rowan's care, and she began her heist. First, the blacksmith, Mr. Hemlock. He was a man of sweat and iron, and he did not trust words. Pike says Rowan Cutter is unfit, Maeve said, standing just inside the smithy, the air hot and ringing with the sound of his hammer. Hemlock spat into the forge. The fire hissed. Pike is a damn fool who's never had soot on his shirt. Unfit. He hammered a glowing horseshoe. Let me tell you about unfit. Unfit is the man who buys on credit and disappears. Unfit is the man who beats his mule. Rowan Cutter. He stopped, resting the hammer. His ledger is in the office. Go look. Every job. Paid on the day. Never late. Maeve went into the small, dusty office. She found the ledger. Her finger traced the entries. Cutter. R. Repaired wagon wheel. Paid. Cutter. R. Shod stallion. Paid. Then she found one Cutter, R, aided in barn raising, note refused payment, accepted 2 sacks of oats, and another Cutter, R, mended water pump, note worked off the debt of Jedstone, who couldn't pay. She closed the book, a new, hard respect settling in her. "Mr. Hemlock," she called, "I need you to copy these pages, and I need you to sign an affidavit that this is your book." He looked at her, a slow smile spreading. "A legal fight. Is it about damn time someone stood up to that railroad? Get the paper, girl. I'll sign it." Next, Reverend Alden, who also had access to the absent doctor's records. He met her in the quiet of the small adobe church. "I already told Mr. Pike that the children were safe here," Alden said. His hand steepled. "He needs more than your word. Reverend, he needs proof. He needs it on paper. He needs to be beaten," Alden said, his voice sharp with a surprising pragmatism. "That man served Silas Grigg, not God. What do you need?" "Doctor, Kincaid's journal. You keep his records when he's on the circuit. I need the entry from last spring." "They found it," Alden read aloud. "April 10th, called to the Azul survey camp. Man, a surveyor, had been bitten by a rattler. Would have been a fatal wound, but Mr. R. Cutter found him, applied a tourniquet, and rode him 20 miles, through the worst electrical storm I have ever witnessed, arrived at my door near midnight. The man lived, Mr. Cutter asked for nothing, not even thanks. Just turned his horse and rode back into the rain." Maeve took the journal. "May I borrow this?" "You may," the Reverend said. "One more thing. I need you to come to the ranch. Today. You must certify my school." An hour later, Reverend Alden sat on the porch railing, his hat in his hands. He watched as Jasper read a paragraph from a newspaper, his voice stumbling but determined. He watched as Millie, her arm in its sling, correctly added 2 columns of figures on a piece of scrap paper. "Reverend," Maeve said, "do these children meet the standards of the territory?" Alden looked at Maeve, his eyes shining. "Miss Hollis," he said, "these children do not just meet the standard. They are loved. That is a standard this territory has long forgotten." He took the affidavit she had prepared and signed it with a flourish, certifying the Lantern Light Porch School as a legitimate educational body. While Maeve gathered the words of the town, Rowan provided the proof of the land. He sat at the kitchen table, a place he usually avoided, and with a piece of charcoal, he was not an artist, but he was a builder. He drew a map. It was a map of safety. He sketched the house, the stable, the well. He labeled them in his blocky, angular script. 60 feet, stone-lined, sweet water, stable, new beams, 1888, house, sound roof, 2 hearths. He was drawing a picture for a bureaucrat, proving in the only language he knew that his world was secure. Jasper, fascinated, watched him. "You missed the chicken coop," he said. Rowan handed him the charcoal. "Show me." Jasper drew a small, messy square. Then he drew a stick figure next to it. "That's Bo. He likes the chickens." He took the charcoal again and drew a large, lopsided circle over the house. "That's the sun," he announced, "so it's not dark." Rowan looked at the map, now co-authored by his son. It was no longer just a diagram of safety. It was a picture of a home. He nodded, his throat thick, and folded it carefully, adding it to Maeve's growing pile. Maeve was smart. She knew Pike was a coward, and cowards were unpredictable. She needed a contingency plan. She went to the Coppervale Inn, run by Odessa Wren, a woman who had seen the worst of men as an army nurse and had decided to profit from them instead. "Odessa," Maeve said, finding the older woman stacking whiskey glasses. "I need a favor. You're the talk of the town. Girl, Cutter's little legal eagle." Odessa's eyes were sharp. "What?" "Pike is going to fight us. He's going to try and declare the ranch unsafe. He might try to take them before the hearing. A surprise evaluation." Odessa stopped stacking. "He wouldn't dare. He's a puppet for Silas Grigg. He'll do what he's told." "So, what do you need?" "A room," Maeve said. "A temporary, safe, unimpeachable residence. If he comes, I need to be able to move the children here and tell him they are under the care of the most respected woman in town." Odessa looked at Maeve, then let out a sharp laugh. "You are a piece of work. You want to use my reputation?" She nodded. "Done. The back room, number 4. The one I keep for the circuit judge. It's the cleanest room in the county. If Pike wants to argue with me about thread counts and lye soap, you tell him to bring his lunch. It'll take all day." Maeve had her safe house. The tension on the ranch was a living thing, but the tension in the hills above it was sharper. That night, under the cover of a moonless, heavy sky, Silas Grigg gave his orders. He stood on the ridge overlooking the arroyo, the dry riverbed that was Rowan Cutter's only water source. "I want the ditch cut by dawn," he told his crew of 3 rough-looking men. "From this bank, straight to the company cistern. Pike has stalled. The storm will do the rest." The men began to work. The sound of their picks hitting the hardpan was a dry, secretive, chipping sound. Chick, chick, chick. It was the sound of a conspiracy, of a war being declared in the dark, a grave being dug for the ranch's future. They were cutting a new channel, a diversion, designed to catch the coming flash flood and steal the water, leaving Cutter's well to dry up by morning. The next day, the air was wrong. The sky was a sickly, bruised yellow. An oppressive stillness had fallen. Maeve, unable to settle, walked the property line. Her nerves were raw. She felt the land as her own, and she felt the threat against it. She walked toward the arroyo, needing to see the water source for herself. As she got close, she saw the faint trail of fresh-dug earth. They had been here. She stopped. Something was wrong with the ground at her feet. It was cracked, sunken, a soft spot, a subsidence, where the earth had been weakened. Her mind, trained to see symptoms, raced. This was a danger. This was a trap. She didn't know how or why, but she knew this spot was unstable. She raced back to the ranch, grabbed a hatchet, and split a piece of firewood into 3 crude steaks. She ripped a bright red dishcloth into strips. She returned to the spot and hammered the stakes deep into the ground, ringing the sunken earth. She tied the red cloths to the tops, where they flapped in the sudden, rising wind. A warning, a small, simple act that would, unknown to her, soon save a life. It was time. Maeve gathered the documents, the testimonies, the map, the affidavit. They rode into town as a family. Rowan, tall and silent, Maeve, her back straight, Jasper, Millie, and Beau riding on the wagon, scrubbed and solemn. They walked into Everard Pike's office. He looked up, his face paling at the sight of the unified front. Maeve did not speak. She simply placed the documents on his desk, one by one, like a gambler laying down a winning hand. The ledger of Mr. Hemlock, proving financial reliability. Thump. The signed testimonial and medical journal from Reverend Alden and Dr. Kincaid, proving moral character and bravery. Thump. The signed affidavit from Reverend Alden, certifying the school. Thump. The map of the property, co-signed by its residents, proving all conditions of safety. Thump. "And here," she said, sliding the last paper in front of him, "is the final application for joint legal guardianship. All it needs is your signature, and ours." Rowan stepped forward. Pike handed him the pen. Rowan Cutter looked at the paper. He looked at Maeve, who nodded at him, her eyes bright. He looked at Jasper, who was watching him with a desperate, hopeful intensity. He put the pen to the paper. Rowan Cutter. Maeve watched his hand, the hand that could control a 1,000-pound horse, the hand that had split the splints for Millie's arm with perfect precision. It was trembling. She realized, with a sudden, aching clarity, that this was the most courageous act of his life. He wasn't afraid of the railroad, or the drought, or Silas Grigg. He was terrified of this, of signing his name to a promise he was desperate not to break. He was terrified of failing them. He finished and pushed the paper and the pen to Maeve. Her own signature was smooth and clear. Maeve Hollis. Pike was trapped. The evidence was overwhelming. The entire town was, on paper, standing with Cutter. But Silas Griggs' orders were clear. He had to stall. Pike picked up the papers, his own hands shaking. This is a most impressive file. Miss Hollis, most impressive. He cleared his throat, looking out the window at the darkening sky. He found his excuse. However, I cannot sign this today. The safety inspection. This map is excellent, but in light of the coming weather... He looked at them, his eyes shifting. The integrity of the ranch, the well, the structures. It could all change. I must, by regulation, conduct a formal survey after the storm has passed. I must defer my decision, pending a final inspection, early next week. It was a stall, and they all knew it. They hadn't won. They had only survived the first round. In the saloon, Pike met Grigg. "I bought you your time," he said, downing a whiskey. "The storm will do the rest." Silas Griggs smiled, looking at the black clouds rolling in. "Exactly. Everard, the rain will come, the ditch will fill, the arroyo will move, and the ranch will be worthless. Nature will decide for us." Back at the lantern light, the waiting began. The air was electric. Rowan was on the roof, hammering down loose tin, his movements fast and angry. Maeve gathered the children inside. The tension was making them frantic. She sat them by the fire. "We are going to learn a new lesson," she said, her voice belying the knot in her stomach. She had written a small, simple poem on a piece of paper. She held it for Millie. "Read this for me." Millie, her good hand tracing the words, read slowly. "The wind can blow, the rain can fall, but the house stands tall. We are the ones who stay." It was a prayer, a declaration of war, a promise. Beau, exhausted by the strange, frightening day, crawled into Maeve's lap. He laid his head on her chest, his small body going limp, and fell fast asleep. His quiet, even breathing was the only sound of peace in the house. Rowan paused in his hammering. He looked through the kitchen window. He saw Maeve, silhouetted by the fire. He saw Millie leaning against her knee. He saw Beau, asleep in her arms. He saw a life he had never dared to imagine, a life of warmth and sound and light. He saw the thing he was truly fighting for. He felt a painful, unfamiliar cracking in his chest, as if the tough, saddle-hardened leather he'd wrapped around his heart for a decade had finally given way. Maeve stepped onto the porch. The wind tore at her hair. It was no longer a breeze. It was a physical, shoving force. Odessa Wren's wagon pulled up in a cloud of dust. She threw a heavy, canvas-wrapped parcel onto the porch. "Bacon and flour, in case you're shut in." Odessa looked at Maeve, her face a grim mask. Then she looked at the churning, greenish-black sky. "Get those children away from the windows," she commanded. "I've seen this sky twice, once in 73, once in 81. It ain't just rain." She looked at Maeve, her voice low and serious. "Child, a storm in this country doesn't ask anyone's name. It just takes..." As Odessa pulled her wagon around, the first drop of rain hit Maeve's face. It was not a small drop. It was as large as a coin, and it was cold as ice. The battle had begun. Odessa's warning was not a prediction. It was a eulogy for the calm. The sky broke open. It was not a rain of drops. It was a solid, falling wall of water. The sound was not a patter. It was a roar, a continuous, deafening drumbeat on the tin roof that made the entire house vibrate. The wind didn't whistle. It shrieked. A physical shoving force that rattled the window panes in their frames and sent icy drafts through every crack in the wood. Within an hour, the world was gone, erased by a curtain of gray, lashing water. The yard became a muddy lake. The wind ripped a shingle from the stable roof and sent it spinning into the gloom like a discarded playing card. And the arroyo was alive. The dry, dusty creek bed that traced the property line was now a monster. Maeve, peering through the small, streaming kitchen window, watched in horror as a churning, brown torrent, thick as molasses, filled the banks. It was no longer a creek. It was a river, born in an instant, and it was carrying entire trees' roots and all in its teeth. It roared with a low, liquid voice that was more terrifying than the wind. Silas Griggs' men had dug their ditch, and now the heavens were providing the flood to fill it. The immediate terror, however, was not outside. It was inside. "Miss M, I'm cold." Maeve spun around. Beau was sitting by the hearth, where she had left him playing with his wooden soldiers. He was wrapped in a blanket, but he was shivering, his teeth chattering with a violence that shook his small frame. Maeve was at his side in an instant, her hand pressed to his forehead. He was burning. His skin was dry and impossibly hot, but he was shivering as if he were packed in ice. "Jasper, get the blankets from my cot. Millie, more wood in the stove. Now!" Her voice, the same one that had commanded Rowan during Millie's fall, cut through the children's fear. They moved. She lifted Beau, his small body already feeling alarmingly light. She laid him on his cot, stripping off his damp day clothes and pulling a dry nightshirt over his head. His breath was coming in short, shallow pants. "It's all right. Beau, it's just a fever. The storm brought a chill," she murmured, her mind racing. This was not a simple chill. This was a prairie fever, striking with the speed of a snake. She worked quickly, her hands sure. She shredded ginger root into a bowl, added hot water, and soaked a rag. She placed the warm, pungent compress on his chest, trying to draw out the heat, and placed cool, damp cloths on his forehead. He began to cough, a dry, barking sound that seemed to rack his entire body. Rowan came in from the porch, his slicker streaming water, his face a grim mask. "The creek's over the banks. If it—" He stopped. He saw Maeve's face. He saw Beau. "What is it?" he asked, his voice suddenly hollow. "Fever," Maeve said, not looking up. She was counting. His breaths were too fast, too shallow. It came on in an instant. Rowan stood by the cot. He looked at the small, flushed face, the eyes screwed shut, the body trembling. This was not a broken bone. This was not something he could fix with wood or rope. This was an invader he couldn't see. Beau whimpered. A small, lost sound. "Miss M," he mumbled, his hand weakly pawing at the blanket. It's too loud." The thunder cracked directly overhead, an explosion that shook the very foundation of the house. Rowan looked from the shivering boy to the black, streaming window. His entire body went rigid. He had made his decision. "I'm going," he said. Maeve looked up, stunned. Going where you'll be swept away before you clear the gate." "Silver Ditch," he said, his voice flat. "Doctor, Kincaid, he's there. He's the only one." "Rowan, no!" Maeve stood, blocking his path. "That's 20 miles. You'll never make it. The bridge over the Azul Fork will be underwater. It's too weak." "I know," he said. He looked past her, at Beau. He gently pushed her aside and grabbed his heavy oilcloth duster. He was not a man of many words, but the few he chose now were final. "You set the bone," he said, his voice low and rough as he strapped a waterproof oilskin pouch to his belt. This is a fight I can't win, but I can fetch the man who can." He met her eyes, and in his, she saw the raw, primal terror of a father about to lose a child. "This part is mine. Maeve, you keep him warm." He was out the door before she could argue again. A dark shape swallowed instantly by the roaring gray. The house became a sealed box, floating in a world of violent sound. The hours dragged. The storm worsened. Maeve worked, her hands tireless. She changed the compresses. She forced sips of willow bark tea between Beau's lips. She bathed his face. Jasper paced. He walked from the window to the door, from the door to the hearth, a small, tormented sentinel. He was counting. 71, 72, 73. He was measuring the time since Rowan had left. a desperate, childish arithmetic against the storm. Millie, her face pale, sat on a stool by the fire. She was reading aloud from Maeve's single book of poems, her voice high and trembling, a thin thread of human sound against the tempest. The wind is loud, but the house is strong. She was using the words as a shield, a spell to keep the thunder at bay, and on the cot, bow tossed, his fever was rising. He was no longer coherent. He was lost. Miss M, don't let the train. It's too loud. Miss M. Maeve's heart broke. She stroked his hair, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. I'm right here. Bo, I'm not going anywhere. There is no train. You are home. Outside. It was not a world. It was chaos. Rowan rode not a horse, but a force of nature. Cole, brave and strong, fought the sucking mud with every step, his breath pluming in the cold. Wet air. The rain was like handfuls of gravel, stinging Rowan's face through his pulled-down hat. He reached the arroyo, the one that bordered his land. It was unrecognizable. It was a half-mile wide, raging, muddy sea. The water, diverted by Silas Griggs' illegal ditch, was now a torrent, and it had completely erased the northern bank. The shortcut. Rowan cursed, the word stolen by the wind. He had to go south, to the narrow rock pass, a longer, more treacherous route. He urged Cole into the driving spray, the horse slipping and scrambling on the dissolving ground. Lightning lit the world, a series of stark, blue-white photographs. In one of those flashes, he saw it, a flash of red, 3 pieces of tattered red cloth, flapping wildly from wooden stakes, exactly at the edge of the path he had been about to take. He hauled back on the reins, a gut-deep instinct screaming at him. "Whoa back, Cole!" The horse slid to a halt, his hooves sinking deep. The ground in front of him, the very spot Maeve had marked, gave way. It did not crumble. It dissolved. With a sound like a giant sigh, a 20-foot section of the bank, weakened by the diverted water and the subsidence Maeve had seen, calved off and collapsed into the flood, where he would have been. There was now only the brown, churning river. He stared, his blood like ice. She had saved him. The red dishcloth, the woman who saw things he did not. He wasted no time. He spun Cole around and plunged into the narrow, treacherous of the rock pass, the horse's iron-shod hooves striking sparks on the slick stone. It was just after midnight when Maeve heard it. She had been dozing, her head fallen against the back of the chair, and the sound snapped her awake. It was not the storm. It was different. She ran to the door, pulling it open against the force of the wind. Jasper was right behind her. Through the sheeting rain, in the gloom, she saw them. 2 horses, not one, 2 shapes, black as night, moving through the mud like ghosts. Rowan was first. He almost fell from the saddle. His duster was torn to ribbons. He was caked in mud from his boot to his hat, his face a pale, spectral white. His eyes sunk deep in his head. Behind him was Dr. Kincaid, a grim, bearded man hunched over his saddle, clutching his black leather bag. "He's here," Maeve breathed, the relief so profound it was painful. They stumbled into the house, the doctor wasting no time. "Boil water, all you have," he snapped, shedding his soaked coat. "And light. I need all the light you've got." The night became a blur of focused, desperate work. The doctor's instruments, the sharp smell of alcohol and quinine, the low, urgent murmur of his voice. Rowan stood by the door, dripping a lake of mud onto the floor, his body shaking with cold and exhaustion, but he did not move. He just watched. The dawn came, not as a light, but as a lessening of the dark. The rain, which had been a roar, subsided to a steady, heavy drum. "Doctor!" Kincaid stood up, rubbing his back. He looked at Maeve, then at Rowan. "He's a tough one," the doctor said, his voice weary. "The fever broke. He's sleeping, really sleeping. Now, you—" He looked at Maeve. "The ginger compresses, the willow bark. You kept him here. I just closed the door." Rowan slid down the wall he was leaning against. his legs finally giving out. He sat on the floor, the tension draining out of him, leaving him looking hollowed out. The house was quiet. The awful, high-pitched panting was gone. The only sounds were the steady rain on the roof and the soft, even breathing of a sleeping child. It was the most beautiful sound in the world, the silence of a battle won. Maeve's legs wouldn't hold her either. She sank into the chair by the hearth. "Doctor." Kincaid was already asleep on the cot she'd given up. She looked across the small room. Rowan was still by the door, his head slumped forward, but he hadn't moved to his own bed. He couldn't. He sat opposite her, his head lolling back against the wooden door jamb, mud-streaked and beaten. He was, finally, asleep. Maeve watched him. For the first time, he was not the guardian. He was not the watcher. He was a man, exhausted, who had finally allowed himself to rest in a home that someone else had helped him secure. She closed her own eyes, just for a minute. In town, the storm was a different kind of problem. Everard Pike sat in his dry, lamp-lit office, staring at the papers on his desk. The door opened, and Silas Grigg entered, shaking water from his hat. "Is it done?" Grigg demanded. "Are you ready to serve the notice the storm will have ruined him?" Pike looked up, his face clammy. I can't, Silas, I can't do the survey. Not now." "What do you mean? You can't? This is our chance." Pike nervously pushed a newly signed paper across the desk. "It's a territorial act. I have to declare a natural disaster area. All county business, all surveys, all evictions, they're suspended, indefinitely, until the damage can be assessed. The bridges are out. The roads are gone. My hands are tied." It was a perfectly legal, bureaucratic maneuver. The storm had given Pike the one thing he craved more than Grigg's money a way out. He had broken Silas's plan. Silas Grigg stared at the paper, his face turning a dark, mottled red. His plan to use the storm, to have Pike declare the ranch unsafe because of the storm, to steal the children and the water was in ruins. The rain that was meant to be his weapon had become his prison. He didn't speak. He turned, walked to the map of the valley on the wall, and stared at the small square marked Cutter R. He took the empty whiskey glass from Pike's desk and, with a sudden, violent roar, hurled it at the map. The glass shattered, leaving a spiderweb of cracks centered directly on the Lantern Light Ranch. Pike flinched, cowering in his chair. "That's fine," Silas hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "Let him have his act of God. The rain will stop. The roads will clear, and when they do—" He pointed a thick finger at the broken map. "Tomorrow, when this rain stops, is the day we lock his water for good." The Copper Vale Town Hall was not a hall of justice. It was a single, long room built of raw pine, and on this day, it was suffocating. The air was thick with the smells of wet wool, stale tobacco, and anxiety. The entire town was crammed onto the rough benches. Mr. Hemlock, his face scrubbed clean of soot, sat next to Reverend Alden. Odessa Wren sat in the front row, her back as straight as a rifle barrel. Ranchers, miners, and shopkeepers filled every remaining space. They were not just here for the drama. They were here because a fight over water was a fight for their own lives. At the front, at a simple wooden table, sat the committee Everard Pike, looking pale and trapped. Reverend Alden, his face grim, and Odessa Wren, who looked, as always, unimpressed by the men around her. The antagonist sat to the right. Silas Grigg, dressed in an expensive black frock coat, looked more like an undertaker than a foreman. Beside him sat a thin, sharp man with spectacles and a leather satchel, a lawyer, imported from back east. He was busy unrolling a large, detailed map of the valley's aquifer, the blue lines looking like a network of veins. Pike banged a small wooden gavel. The low murmur of the crowd died. "This," Pike began, his voice high and reedy, "is a preliminary hearing to assess the custodial fitness of Mr. Rowan Cutter and Miss Maeve Hollis for the miners Jasper Cole, Millie Farrow, and Bo." He shuffled his papers, avoiding everyone's eyes. "To be clear," he continued, The formal objections regarding the ranch's material conditions, food, shelter, safety have been provisionally met. Miss Hollis has provided extensive documentation. He gestured to the pile of paper Maeve had submitted. The issue at hand is one of legal guardianship. The territory must determine the most suitable, stable, and permanent placement for these children. The committee will hear arguments and render a temporary decision. He looked at Maeve. Miss Hollis, Mr. Cutter, you may begin. All eyes turned to Maeve. She stood, holding a single folder. She was not dressed in her dusty calico. She had washed and pressed her one good traveling dress, a dark, serviceable blue. She looked like the school teacher she was. Mr. Pike, members of the committee, she began, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the room. You have my documents. You have the signed ledger from Mr. Hemlock, proving Mr. Cutter's financial reliability. You have the certification from Reverend Alden, approving the curriculum of the Lantern Light Porch School. You have the map of the ranch's safety features, drawn by Mr. Cutter and verified by his children. Her voice was calm, a scalpel of pure fact. But paper does not speak to character. For that, I would ask Mrs. Odessa Wren to say a few words. Odessa stood, turning not to Pike, but to the crowd. Last year, she boomed, her voice filling the room. Jed Stone's boy, Sammy, fell down the old dry well. He was 7. Jed was frantic. I was frantic. The boy was 30 feet down. His leg broke. She pointed a finger at Rowan, who sat stiff and motionless, his hat in his lap. That man, Rowan Cutter, he showed up, didn't say a word. He looked at the hole, he looked at me, and he said, the rope ain't strong enough for me. Get me the mule's harness. He rigged a sling, had us lower him down that hole, in the dark, knowing it could crumble. He was down there for an hour, splinting that boy's leg with his own shirt and a piece of the broken ladder. Then he had us haul them both up. He handed the boy to his PA, got on his horse, and rode home. Never asked for a dime, never spoke of it again. She sat down. A heavy silence filled the room. Silas Griggs smiled, a thin, dismissive curl of his lip. He nudged his lawyer, who stood up, adjusting his spectacles. A commendable act of rustic bravery, but it has no bearing on legal suitability. What, mister? Grigg and the Azul Western Railroad wish to point out is that a developing territory requires civilization. It requires progress. Grigg, impatient, cut him off, standing himself. His voice was smooth, oily. What my colleague means, friends, is that civilization is more than a strong back. It's structure, it's discipline. It's a proper school, not a porch. It's a future. He gestured toward Maeve and Rowan. Are we to believe these children's best future lies on an isolated, failing ranch in the care of a reclusive bachelor and a woman of no fixed address? The insult hung in the air. Maeve tensed, but before she could speak, Rowan Cutter moved. He did not just stand. He unfolded. He rose to his full, imposing height, and the room seemed to shrink. He had not spoken. He had not moved. Now, he did. He turned his head and looked at Silas Grigg. The room held its breath. Civilization, Rowan said, his voice a low, heavy rumble. Not loud, but it silenced every cricket outside. Civilization doesn't take drinking water from the mouths of children. The words hit the room like a physical blow. He had, in one sentence, reframed the entire hearing. This was not a custody battle. This was a water theft. And he had just accused Grigg in front of the entire valley. The ranchers on the benches nodded, their faces hardening, before the lawyer could sputter a response. Maeve stepped forward. Mr. Pike, she said, cutting into the tension. You are here to determine the children's well-being. I ask that you hear from them. Objection, the lawyer snapped. You cannot put children on the stand. I am not, Maeve said, her voice like ice. I am asking the committee to observe them, to see the damage, mister. Grigg implies. Jasper, his face white, his knuckles paler, stood up. He was holding a single, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it, his hands shaking so badly he could barely read. I wrote a letter," he whispered. "Speak up, son," Reverend Alden said gently. Jasper swallowed, took a deep, ragged breath, and read. My name is Jasper Cole. I came on a train. I did not have a home." He paused, his voice cracking. He looked at Rowan, who nodded at him. A single, sharp dip of his chin. Jasper continued, his voice suddenly stronger. "Mr. Cutter, he gave me a bed. Miss M, she taught me my letters. Millie and Bo, we're—" He looked down at the paper. "Home is not a place. Home is not blood. Home is the one who stays. They stayed. I am staying. That is all." He sat down, fast, as if his legs had given out. Pike, visibly moved, cleared his throat. "Millie," he said softly, "your arm, does it pain you, child?" Millie stood, her splinted arm held carefully in its sling. She looked at Pike, her eyes huge. It's healing, sir," she whispered. "Miss M said it, Doctor. Kincaid said it was good." She looked at the committee, her lower lip trembling. I just need more time to heal, sir. Please, at home." The visual was devastating. The child Grigg wanted to send to an institution, holding up the arm that Maeve, the woman of no fixed address, had saved. The lawyer saw the room slipping away. He scrambled, moving to his map. This is all emotion. This is not law. The fact is, the ranch is unsafe, as our own surveys prove." He unrolled another diagram, this one showing the new diversion ditch Grigg's men had dug. "Our water management plan, this diversion is essential. Mr. Cutter's arroyo is unstable. It is a flood risk. We are, in fact, protecting the valley and his land." "A lie," Maeve said. She spoke the word, and it cut through the lawyer's bluster. "Excuse me, Miss Hollis," Pike said. "That is a lie. He did not dig that ditch to protect anyone. He dug it to steal water. And in doing so, he endangered every person in this room." She pulled her own final document from her folder. It was a crude drawing, a map. "This," she said, "is a map of the Arroyo Bank. 3 days ago, before the storm, I found this, a dangerous subsidence, a sinkhole, caused by the ground being weakened." She pointed. "And these are the red markers I staked around it, to warn Mr. Cutter, the ditch your men dug, Mr. Grigg in the dark, without a permit, and during a storm warning was cut directly above this unstable ground." She turned to Rowan. "Rowan, tell them what you saw in the storm." Rowan's voice was flat. "The markers, her red flags, I saw them. I was on the north bank. The ground, it gave way. Where the path was, where she'd marked." He looked at Grigg. "If not for those flags, I'd be dead." The room was in an uproar. "He dug on unstable land. He tried to kill him. That's illegal." Odessa Wren stood up. "Pike, that's not just water theft." "That's criminal endangerment. You're a county man. What are you going to do about that?" Pike was white. He was trapped. He looked at Grigg, whose face was a mask of cold fury. He looked at Maeve, who was watching him, her gaze unwavering. He looked at his fellow committee members. Reverend Alden looked disgusted. Odessa looked murderous. He had no choice. The law, which he had tried to use as a weapon, was now his only shield. He slammed the gavel. "Order, order." He took a deep breath. "Based on the testimony, based on the clear violation of territorial safety statutes regarding excavation, I am issuing an immediate, a temporary injunction. All work by the Azul Western Railroad on or near the arroyo is to cease and desist, pending a full environmental review by the Territorial Surveyor's Office." A cheer went up. Grigg's lawyer was packing his bag. Silas Grigg just stared at Maeve, his eyes promising a different kind of war. "And," Pike continued, his voice weak, on the matter of the children." He read from his paper, his voice wooden. "The committee finds that the immediate safety and welfare of the minors are being met. We grant provisional joint guardianship to Mr. Rowan Cutter and Miss Maeve Hollis, pending a final signature from the territorial judge in Santa Fe. The children will not be removed." The rest was a blur. The room exploded in slaps on the back. Odessa Wren was hugging a stunned Maeve. Jasper was clinging to Rowan's leg. Silas Grigg and his lawyer were gone. Half an hour later, the five of them stood on the boardwalk outside the hall. The air was cool and clean, washed by the storm. The sun was a pale, watery yellow. Maeve gathered her papers, her hands finally shaking. The children were quiet, shell-shocked by the victory. Rowan stood apart from them, near the hitching post. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking up at the wide, open New Mexico sky. He wasn't smiling. He didn't move. He just breathed. It was a breath he had been holding for 10 days, a deep, shuddering inhalation that filled his lungs, his shoulders dropping as the immense, crushing weight of the last few weeks finally rolled off him. He let it out in a long, slow sigh. Maeve watched him. She saw the relief, but she also saw the exhaustion. She looked down the road, in the direction Silas Grigg had gone. They had won. They had used the paper. They had used the law. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that this was not the end. Silas Grigg was not a man who fought with paper. The next battle would not be in a courtroom. It would be on the land, and it would be fought with fire. The afternoon that followed the hearing was a quiet exhale. The sky, scrubbed clean by the storm, was a high, pale blue. A fragile peace settled over the Lantern Light Ranch, the kind that comes after a fever breaks. It was a day for mending, for putting the world back in order. Maeve, needing the rhythm of simple work, took the children to the west fence line, where the wind had loosened a section of posts. Jasper, feeling a new sense of ownership, worked with a quiet intensity, pulling the wire taut while Maeve held it. Millie and Bo were tasked with gathering the stray rocks that had washed down from the ridge, their small hands working to reclaim their land. There was a feeling of lightness in the air, a giddiness that came with a reprieve from fear. Millie was chattering, Jasper was humming, and the work was easy. Maeve, caught in the simple joy of it, reached for a new length of wire. She misjudged the distance, the hem of her skirt. The good blue one she had not yet changed, snagged on a barb. She felt the sharp tug, heard the small, violent rip of the fabric. She pulled back, but too late. A thin, vicious strand of wire had caught her, slicing a delicate line across her calf. It was not a deep cut, but it was sharp, and a single, perfect line of bright red blood welled up instantly against her pale skin. "Oh," she said, a small, surprised sound. Rowan was there. He had been in the stable, but he had been watching them, and he had seen the stumble, the slight wince. He moved from the shadows of the stable into the bright afternoon sun without a sound, his long strides eating up the ground. He was beside her before she had fully registered the sting. He didn't speak. He simply knelt in the damp earth in front of her. His large hands, the hands that had trembled as he signed the legal papers, were now perfectly steady. They hovered for a moment over the torn fabric of her skirt. He looked up at her, his pale eyes searching her face. His gaze was a question, a request for permission. It was more intimate than a touch. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Slowly, carefully, he took the edge of her skirt between his thumb and forefinger. He lifted it. He lifted it just enough to reveal the scratch. No higher. It was a gesture of such profound, scrupulous respect that it made her breath catch in her throat. His movements were deliberate, clinical, and yet deeply personal. He was a man navigating a new and fragile territory. From his pocket, he took a small, clean cloth. He had been on his way to the stable with it, a cloth he kept soaked in a poultice of yarrow and comfrey for the horses. He gently, so gently, dabbed at the blood. The touch of the cool, damp cloth on her skin was a relief, but the warmth of his knuckles, which brushed against her leg for a fleeting second, was a jolt of lightning. A small gust of wind, a leftover from the storm, came down from the mesa. It lifted a stray strand of hair from Maeve's temple and blew it across her cheek. She looked down. At the sight of this large, rough, quiet man kneeling in the dirt, his entire focus on this tiny, insignificant wound, she saw his hands, calloused and scarred, performing this delicate act of healing. She looked from her own small injury to the man who was treating it as if it were the most important thing in the world, as if her safety, her well-being, was his highest priority. And, in that moment, the last of her own carefully built fences crumbled into dust. His work was done. The bleeding had stopped. He was still kneeling, his hand still resting near her ankle. He did not look at the scratch. He looked up at her face, the roar of the storm, the tension of the hearing, the fear for Beau's life. It had all stripped him bare. What was left was something raw and true. He spoke. His voice was a whisper, a low, rough sound, scraped raw by all the things he had not said. Say yes. It was not a question. It was a plea, a command, a statement of a truth that had become as essential as air. He moved his other hand from his pocket. He opened it. Lying on his rough, calloused palm was not a ring of gold or silver. It was the thank you ring Millie had made for her, the loop of grubby string, the 3 beads, one blue, one white, one fiery red. He was offering her not a promise of wealth, but a place in the small, fierce, fragile family they had forged together in the fire. Maeve felt the air leave her lungs in a sharp, shuddering gasp. Her chest rose and fell, her heart hammering a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. The world narrowed to his face, to his pale, earnest eyes, to the beaded ring lying on his palm. She could not speak. The word was too large, too momentous. So she nodded, a single, deep, decisive nod. Her eyes, which had been so clear and sharp in the courtroom, filled with a sudden, brilliant sheen of tears. Yes, she breathed. The word, a bare whisper, but it was all he needed. A smile broke across Rowan Cutter's face. It was a rare, startling thing, like seeing a century plant bloom in a single afternoon. It transformed him. It erased the lines of worry and grief, leaving only a raw, unshielded joy. He stood up. He looked at her, then at the wide, muddy puddle by the gate that the storm had left behind. Without a word, he bent, slid one arm behind her back and the other under her knees, and lifted her. She was light in his arms. She made a small, surprised sound, and her arms went around his neck instinctively. As he stepped over the muddy patch, her skirt, already torn, was lifted clear of the mud. Her legs, in a natural, unconscious act of balance, curled slightly, her boots hooking gently behind his hips. It was an embrace born of necessity that became, in an instant, an act of profound intimacy. He carried her to the porch and set her down gently. He did not step back. He stayed close, his hands resting on her waist. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers. Maeve closed her eyes. She could feel his breath on her lips, warm and smelling of the clean desert air. Her own breath was unsteady, catching in her throat. She could feel the solid strength of him, the heat radiating from his chest. Her hands came up, not to push him away, but to steady herself, to hold this moment. They settled on his jaw, her thumbs tracing the rough, sun-cured line of it. His lips touched hers. It was a kiss as light as morning mist, a soft, hesitant question, a question that had been waiting a lifetime to be asked. She answered, not with words, but with a slight, yielding pressure, a tilt of her head. He paused then, a fractional space between them, his eyes searching hers, asking again, without words. She gave another small, definite nod. Yes, the kiss deepened. It was not a kiss of fire and desperation, but of homecoming. It was warm, and slow, and sure. It tasted of relief, of rain-washed sage, and of a profound, unspoken gratitude. It was a kiss that sealed every promise they had made with their actions, a silent vow in the afternoon sun. From inside the house, a small sound, a single, deliberate, ahem. They broke apart, but not far. They turned their heads. Jasper was standing in the open kitchen doorway, a small, knowing smile on his face. He held a glass of water, a transparent excuse. Rowan and Maeve looked at each other, and a shared, silent laugh passed between them. They were still standing close, his forehead still touching hers. They were a couple, but they were also a family. They would never truly be alone again. He rested his cheek against her hair, and she could feel his heart, a strong, steady beat against her own, like the sound of a lone horseman, finally home, his hooves striking the dry, familiar earth. That night, after the children were asleep, the house was filled with a new kind of quiet. It was not the silence of loneliness, but of contentment. They sat by the hearth, the fire casting a warm, flickering glow. Maeve was leaning against Rowan's shoulder, a wool blanket he had draped over her lap tucked around her knees. He spoke, his voice low in the quiet room. He told her about a childhood spent in a gray, crowded orphanage back east. He spoke of never having a name that felt like his own, of never having a place to stand. He spoke of coming west not for gold, but for emptiness, for a space so large it could swallow his own painful memories. "I never meant to build a home," he whispered, his voice thick. "I was just collecting the pieces that other people had thrown away. I didn't know. I didn't know you were the piece that was missing." Maeve didn't answer. She just tightened her hand over his, her beaded ring pressing into his calloused skin. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. On the far wall, the flames painted their two silhouettes, close together, a single, unified shadow. The image flickered, warm and intimate, a private portrait of a love that had been forged in the harshest of lands. It was a scene of fiery, unspoken passion, of two solitary figures who had finally, against all odds, found their way home. Their bodies, in the quiet firelight, said everything that words no longer needed to. The letter from Santa Fe arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet creak of the postman's wagon. It was a single, thick envelope of official government stock, addressed in a neat, bureaucratic hand to Mr. R. Cutter, Miss M. Hollis, Lantern Light Ranch. They stood on the porch, the five of them, and watched the postman disappear in a cloud of dust. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in Rowan's hand. This was it, the final word. A single signature from a judge who had never met them, who had never seen Jasper's fierce loyalty, or Millie's brave smile, or Beau's trusting eyes. A man in a distant city held their entire world in his inkwell. Rowan's hand was steady now. He looked at Maeve, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded, her hand finding his, her fingers lacing through his. Together, they were a wall. He broke the seal. It was a thick, impressive wafer of red wax, stamped with the territorial eagle. It cracked open with a sound like a dry twig snapping. He unfolded the paper. The legal language was dense, but the final, operative sentence was clear. Wherefore, the court finds the petitioners to be of sound moral character and sufficient material provision, and does hereby grant the application for joint legal guardianship. Rowan Cutter is appointed legal protector. Maeve Hollis is appointed legal custodian of education and welfare. It was done. The paper was official. The seal was real. The words were law. Jasper let out a whoop, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Millie threw her good arm around Maeve's waist, burying her face in her skirt. Beau, understanding the emotion, if not the words, clapped his small hands. Rowan didn't cheer. He simply folded the paper, carefully, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his shirt, placing it over his heart. He looked at Maeve, and the profound, bone-deep relief in his eyes was more eloquent than any shout of victory. The red seal on the document was not just wax. It was a new sun, rising over their valley. But while the sun was rising on the lantern light, a different kind of storm was gathering in the heart of Silas Grigg. He had heard about the ruling. He had seen the quiet celebration in town, and he had seen the sky. Another band of dark. Heavy clouds was massing over the mountains. To the ranchers, it was a blessing, a promise of more life-giving water. To Silas Grigg, it was a final opportunity. Pike has tied my hands with his injunction. He snarled to the 3 men he had hired, his voice a low growl in the back room of the saloon. But he can't stop an act of God. His plan was simple, brutal, and arrogant. The first storm had weakened the Arroyo Bank. This next rain, he reasoned, would finish the job. He just needed to give it a little help. "You're going back up there tonight," he ordered, throwing a pouch of coins on the table. "You're going to reopen that ditch, widen it. When this new rain hits, the flash flood will tear Cutter's Bank to pieces. The Arroyo will shift its course permanently. Pike's injunction will be meaningless. It will be a natural event, and all that water will belong to the Azul Western." That night, under a sky pregnant with rain, the 3 men worked. They were not quiet. They were angry, their work fueled by Grigg's whiskey and their own resentment. The sound of their picks and shovels was a defiant, ugly scar on the night's quiet. But they were not engineers. They were thugs. In their haste to widen the illegal ditch, they paid no mind to the ground beneath their feet. They ignored the cracks from the previous flood. They did not see that the very earth they stood on, the bank that held back their own company's newly filled cistern, had been weakened by their own previous digging. The rain began. A soft, insistent drizzle. Then, as if a switch had been thrown, it became a downpour, and the land gave way. It did not happen with a roar. It happened with a low, sickening groan. The ground, already saturated, already weakened by the ditch, simply dissolved. But it was not Rowan Cutter's Bank that collapsed. It was the bank Silas Grigg's men were standing on. With a great, sucking sound, the very earth beneath the company's cistern collapsed into the new, deep channel they had just dug. The cistern, a massive wooden tank holding tens of thousands of gallons of diverted water, tilted, groaned, and then burst apart. The resulting flood, a monstrous, man-made wave, did not rush toward Rowan's land. It rushed backward into the collapsed ditch, a torrent of mud, splintered wood, and Grigg's stolen water, scouring the land and flooding the railroad's own survey camp in the valley below. The stick had broken in the hand of the one who wielded it. The next day, the town hall was once again full, but this time, the mood was not tense. It was triumphant. Everard Pike, his face a mixture of relief and newfound official courage. Read his findings. The Azul Western Railroad Company, under the direction of foreman Silas Grigg, did knowingly and with criminal negligence perform illegal excavation, resulting in catastrophic damage to their own property and posing a significant threat to the valley. He looked up, meeting the eyes of the assembled ranchers. "I am therefore issuing the maximum fine allowed under territorial law. Furthermore, the Azul Western is hereby ordered to restore the natural flow of the Arroyo, at their own expense, under the direct supervision of this county." The room exploded. Men stomped their feet. They threw their hats in the air. It was a victory for every man who had ever felt the squeeze of the railroad, for every family who had ever worried about their water. It was the valley's victory. And in the midst of it, Maeve and Rowan and the children slipped out, their own battle finally, truly, over. The wedding was not in the church. It was in the world they had fought for. It took place under the great, ancient cottonwood tree behind the ranch house as the sun began to set, turning the dust to gold. There were no pews, only benches carried from the house. The light came not from stained glass, but from a string of oil lamps that Rowan had hung from the branches, their small, flickering flames like captured stars. Maeve wore no veil. She wore a simple dress of pale cream, and Millie, her arm now free of its splint, carefully pinned a sprig of wild lavender into her hair. The air smelled of clean earth and crushed herbs. The rings were not gold, they were copper, forged by Mr. Hemlock himself, a gift from the town. They were still warm from the forge. Bo was the ring bearer. He carried the 2 copper bands on a small, embroidered pillow Maeve had made. He walked with a solemn, profound concentration, his eyes fixed on the rings. Halfway to the makeshift altar, he took a slight, meandering detour to inspect a particularly interesting beetle, and the entire gathering broke into a warm, gentle wave of laughter. He looked up, startled, found his way again, and proudly presented the pillow. Reverend Alden stood before them. "There are words," he said, "that the church provides for this moment, but I think, today, the words should belong to the ones who have earned them." He looked at Rowan Cutter, the man of few words, looked at Maeve. He took her hands in his. His were rough and calloused. Hers were soft and capable. "Maeve," he said, his voice low and steady, a rock in the shifting world. "I don't have fancy words. I only have this." He squeezed her hands. "I promise you that every morning you wake up in my house, you will know that you are needed. You will know that you are wanted. And you will know that you are loved. That's all I have. But I give you all of it." It was Maeve's turn. The crowd waited, but she didn't speak. Her vow was silent. She simply let go of one of his hands and placed her own, flat, over his heart, on the spot where he had tucked the letter from Santa Fe. She felt the strong, steady, thumping beat beneath her palm. It was the truest sound she had ever heard. She looked into his eyes and smiled, a promise more profound than any words she could have spoken. That evening, on the porch, a lone fiddle played a soft, clumsy waltz. Rowan took Maeve in his arms. He was not a dancer. His heavy boots were awkward. She stepped on his toes, and they both laughed. He pulled her closer, his hand firm and warm in the small of her back, and he stopped trying to dance. He just held her, swaying gently to the music, his forehead resting on the top of her head. The oil lamps flickered. The children's quiet laughter drifted from inside, and the vast, starry sky held them in its embrace. Life settled. It did not become easy, but it became good. The porch school moved to a permanent spot under the cottonwood tree, with a real chalkboard propped against 2 barrels. Jasper, now Rowan's shadow, learned to mend a harness, his small hands mimicking his father's. Millie, her arm fully healed, devoured books, reading tales of adventure aloud to Beau in the evenings. Beau, for his part, crafted a magnificent kite out of newspaper and sticks. On its tail, in big, clumsy chalk letters, he had drawn a single, giant M. One quiet afternoon, Maeve sat by the hearth. She took out her small linen box, the one with the faded blue ribbon, the one that held the name Eliza. She did not open it to grieve. She took a needle and thread, and she carefully stitched the old, faded ribbon onto the corner of a new, soft wool blanket she was knitting for Beau. She was not forgetting her loss. She was weaving it into the fabric of her new life, a memory to be carried forward with love, not left behind in sorrow. Silas Grigg left Copper Vale. He did not leave in disgrace. He simply disappeared. One day he was there, the next, his office was empty. The railroad continued its relentless push west, its steel tracks glinting in the sun, but it ran on water from a different valley. That evening, as the last rays of the sun painted the mesa in shades of deep purple and rose, Maeve and Rowan stood on the porch, watching the children fly the kite. The wind, once their enemy, was now their partner, lifting Beau's creation high into the twilight. The air carried the scent of new grass and the sound of children's laughter. Rowan put his arm around Maeve's shoulders. "Home," he said, the word no longer a question, but a statement of fact, "is the one who stays." Maeve leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the kite soar. "And," she added, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty, "it's the one who says yes when the storm comes." The view pulled back. The Lantern Light Ranch, its roof glowing like silver fish scales in the last light, the sound of chickens settling in for the night, and a single kite with a single M on its tail, dancing against the vast, darkening sky. A family, not of blood, but of hands, held tight. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Please, leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, we'd be so grateful if you would subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting that hype button to help us share these stories with even more people. Your support means the world to us.